speed through this. In literacy, the problem that faces us in literacy is fairly stark. Can anyone tell me what the shape of the National Assessment of Education progress in reading scores in the 8th grade looks like for the past 40 years? Flat. It's good crowd. It's exactly right. There's been no movement. One of the least interesting press events you can get to is a release of the 8th grade NAEP scores in reading, because they always act like this tiny change is significant, and it's really pathetic. You look at it, it's like a tabletop. In that 40-year period, we have doubled educational spending. We've made some advances in early reading and kids reading more at 4th grade, but we have hit a wall in later literacy. That is the challenge that faces us in literacy. When I sum up the standards for ELA and literacy, I describe them as a battering ram or a spear to try to take down that wall. And so, as you encounter teachers who tell you that they are already doing what the Common Core requires of them in literacy, it should worry you a great deal. Because if they are already doing it, we're in a lot of trouble, because we haven't had movement for 40 years. So please hold on to your seatbelts to think if we're going to dramatically shift later reading performance, it's going to take some clear and systematic shifts. And I'm going to outline 6 of those for you today. It begins actually, interestingly, in the elementary school, the preparation to read at a higher level. Today, overwhelmingly what kids read in kindergarten and 5th grade are stories, are literature. It is 80 to 90% of what's on their exams. It's 80% or more of what's in their curriculum. We have separate data that kids spend 7% of their time in kindergarten and 5th grade reading informational text of any sort. Within that 7% is reading about science, history, or the arts. That is in the face of overwhelming research that virtually everyone agrees with, that the general knowledge kids build in those early years is a crucial predictor of not only their later ability to do history and science and work in the disciplines, but their ability to read altogether more complex text, because they gain a vocabulary and a knowledge that enables them to read more difficult things. The core standards for the first time demand that there's an equal balance between literature in K-5 and informational text. So it's 50-50. And it further recommends that as students are reading informational text, texts about the world, about history, science, and the arts, social studies, that they build within the year and across years a coherent body of knowledge as they do so. Look what happened. First, we made kindergarten, 5th grade kind of all about stories and literature, and then we extended the literacy block, right? It got longer and longer to deal with the math and reading tests. So what did we do? We effectively banned history and science from the elementary school. These standards reclaim the elementary teacher's rightful role to teach their students about the world, in addition to the stories they share. And while it's crucial that kids gain a sense of story and its structure, and that is powerful within these standards, it's equally powerful that they gain a growing knowledge of the world through reading and writing about it, speaking and listening about it. And these standards reclaim that territory. And I think it's a very exciting moment for elementary teachers across this city who reclaim their rightful role as teaching students about the world that we live in. That idea, that's the first shift. The second shift, and let me be clear, that is a shift that will follow through in both instruction and assessment. So you'll see elementary school assessment shift, so it's 50-50 as well. Second, in later grades, they asked us at first to write ELA standards, and we said, we won't do it. College and career-ready English language arts standards will not do the job. It is a contradiction to say you're college and career-ready just because you're good at ELA. Because overwhelmingly what you're going to read in college and career is dense nonfiction text, more typically encountered in history, social studies classrooms, science classrooms, technical classrooms, a whole range of classrooms. So we insisted, and the standards that are adopted in this state as others, are standards in ELA and literacy in history and social studies, as well as science and technical subjects. These do not ask, they require that teachers in 6th through 12th grade ensure that their students use reading and writing to build knowledge in their disciplines. In history and social studies, that is precisely to analyze primary and secondary texts and gain knowledge from them. We don't need them teaching reading or style or becoming a literacy teacher. We need them instead to require that their kids can gain content knowledge and depth of understanding through reading and writing. Because without that, they are never independent learners. Similarly in science. I'll speak a little bit more of that if we have time later. But that's the second shift. Just so you know the difference that I mean here, I want to just illustrate it with one example. You might think it's a great history classroom where a teacher says, there was a guy named James Madison. We're looking together today at Federalist Paper number 51, in which he outlines the idea of faction. And here are 3 things that James Madison thought about faction, and you should know them. That's a great history class, right? Except it is in no way taught the students to read carefully. What if the teacher instead said, here is a page of Federalist Paper 51. From this page and this page alone, what do you know and not know about what Madison thought about faction? If you can do that, not only are you going to have a much better understanding of faction, but you'll be able to read Federalist Paper 52 and Federalist Paper 53. So the idea here in the content areas is to force much more situations in which students and teachers are learning from text directly and carefully and drawing evidence from that text. The third shift is a shift towards a focus on text complexity. Typically, ELA standards, if you have the lucky chance to read through as many of them as I have, you'll notice strange things. So in 5th grade reading, you have to understand a character's motivation. In 7th grade reading, you have to understand the character's underlying motivation. Now, if you're a New Yorker, you understand most people's motivations are underlying unless they are mugging you. So it's not a particularly useful distinction to say that now in 7th grade we're going to get to the underlying motivations. What really changes as kids grow as readers is not that they suddenly learn how to find the main idea. It is that they can do so with a much more complex text. That is, what college and career readiness is most predicted by, the single greatest predictor of college and career readiness, is that you can read a sufficiently complex text with confidence and understanding. That being a range of text, including, as I was mentioning, technical, scientific text, historical text, and crucially, literary text. So these standards, for the first time, create a staircase of text complexity. That is, in each year, they set clear requirements for the level of text complexity students must master in order to be ready for the true demands of college and career. And what we found in the research is an interesting thing. It's in Appendix A. You get extra credit, by the way, if you read Appendix A of the literacy standards. And in them, it shows you that the level of text kids are reading systematically in high schools today is far below the level required by first-year college courses and first-year training in careers and technical areas. So why is there a huge remediation rate? Because they're practicing at a level that in no way prepares them for what is to come. The core standards heal this rift, not by just making it harder at the end, but in every year, demanding a level of complexity that puts kids on a path. The fourth area is text-dependent questions. We did an informal study of instruction in 2 states. We tried to pick states that were as similar as possible, so we chose Vermont and Texas. And we found that there was a remarkable similarity between these 2 very different places. That is, 80% of the questions students were asked when dealing with text did not depend on the text in front of them to answer. That is, if you are dealing with Martin Luther King's letter and you talk about what you feel about nonviolence, or you talk about Egypt, or you talk about what it reminds you of, or another event, or when you were confined in your bathroom, none of this requires a careful analysis of the text in front of you. Even though it may seem critical thinking, it may seem deep, but perhaps what is most deep is to dare to ask, what are his first 3 arguments as to why he's in Birmingham? And what different sorts of evidence does he use to support him? Given the letter you have in front of you, what can you infer just from King's letter about the letter he received? These kinds of questions force us to pay attention to the text in front of us and draw evidence from it. The 5th shift is in writing. I'm almost done. What are the 2 most popular forms of writing in the American high school today? And it's true of New York too. Poetry is an ambitious idea. I think texting beats that pretty clearly, but that's not for credit. But narrative writing of 2 sorts. A narrative of your personal opinion or a narrative of your experience, of your life experience. Those are the 2 most popular. And I'll speak to you as a New Yorker. The sad thing about growing up is you realize people don't really give a shit about what you feel or what you think. What they do care about is that you can argue using evidence, that you can make a claim and support it with evidence that is public and shareable. That's what college demands, that's what the workplace demands. And furthermore, it requires that you convey complex information clearly. So the core standards mark a substantial shift, and they make very clear in the high school years that the two forms students must master are writing to inform and writing to argue. And those forms are developed from kindergarten up, so there's a real staircase again to building that mastery. Narrative writing does remain in these standards and students' ability to express themselves in that crucial way, but then it leads to these others. That is, narrative becomes crucial in sequencing to arguing well and to informing. The final change is that academic vocabulary becomes the true language of power in these standards. What do I mean by that? If you were to look at typical ELA standards, like an English language arts textbook in 6th to 12th grade, the first 10 to 15 pages of it are just the list of literary terms that your kids are, you know these, metonymy, synecdoche, circling plot, falling plot, rising action, etc., etc., etc. The most popular third grade standard in America before these standards were written was what is the difference between a tale, a legend, a fairy tale, or a myth? Does that sound familiar? Students know the difference. The only problem is, no one really knows what the difference is between those things. And it's not clear it would matter if they did. So instead of this endless work on literary terminology, some of which is very useful and teachers have the ability still to use, there's a focus on academic vocabulary. What is academic vocabulary? It is the words that are common throughout virtually all complex texts. By this I mean not the everyday language I'm talking to you in now and we hear all the time, or even domain-specific language like cell wall and amoeba. Those are often helpfully on the right side of the page bolded. But what is not bolded with a definition ever is words like consequential, subsequent, hypothesis, criteria. These kinds of academic language are common to all difficult texts, whether they're literary texts or informational texts. And particularly for our English language learners, they make a hidden wall that prevents them from participating in complex texts. The core standards makes them its focus. So those are the 6 shifts in literacy. I sometimes sum them up as reading like a detective and writing like an investigative reporter. That is what we need students to do with texts of increasing complexity. And with Charlotte Danielson in the room, I'll give you another metaphor. It is also to read and observe as an excellent juror does, focused humanely and wisely on the evidence that is before them. Because no one, in my judgment, has thought harder about evidence in teaching than Charlotte. And at the heart of the core standards is the idea that when you're reading, to dare to pay attention to precisely what's happening there and judge it and evaluate it based on its own evidence is the most powerful thing you can do, and then to express it and write about it clearly, as well as speak and listen about it.